was.
I can just go, be on air. Right now?
I have to start the broadcast.
I'm ready.
If I sit down, then it'll start.
I'm ready. Can you just get me a glass of water, please? I'm so sorry, I'm high maintenance. Because everyone scheduled me up the wazoo.
All right, when you hear, yes, they can see your screen, but they can't hear it.
What do I push again when they have to hear me?
Nothing. Everything's set up. I have to push the broadcast button.
And then how does this go away?
This should just.
I know, but I can't. I hate seeing this because people.
Don't close out of it. Hold
Okay,
on.
that's the only thing. I'm so sorry. They scheduled me to death.
All right.
Thank you. You'll tell me when?
Yep, you'll hear the broadcast
Got it.
now started.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the webinar. I'm Cheryl Frischman with Littman Krooks, and this webinar on transition is part of our very special webinar series. And we're going to be talking about transition today, and this is such an important topic for students and families with special needs. It's so important that we actually are doing a talk on general transition today, but because we're able to do these webinars in a monthly series, the next 3 webinars are all going to break down transition even further. Because what I've always found is when I talk about this important topic, there's so many follow-up questions. And so as we go through the webinar, I will talk to you about certain things that we will spend a whole hour on the next 3 webinars. So today we're going to talk about transition. And we have many, many transition points I'm having a little bit of trouble okay, here we go. So we have many transition points in our lives. And transition basically means we shift from one role to another. We've all transitioned in our own lives, and our children have as well. In special education, we have the transition. If your child was in early intervention and moved to CPSE, and then again from CPSE to CSE. The transition from school to post-school is the transition that we're going to talk about today. And this transition for the special education child is especially challenging. It's challenging because the special education child is leaving the relatively supportive special education system and going to an adult world which does not provide the same support. And you're saying, haha, Cheryl, relatively supportive special education system? Really? How is it supportive? It's been difficult all along. It's much more supportive than what you're going to see in post-school, because this is what life is like after high school. After a child ages out of special education, which, as we've discussed previously in our webinars, which are all on demand if you ever want to go back, a child is entitled to special education until they're 21 or until they graduate, whichever comes sooner. And we talk about that, I think, in webinar number 1 that we did many months ago. But after if the child goes to college post-18 because they graduate and had an IEP in high school, or if they age out at 21, then everything changes drastically. Whether or not you're going to a college setting for a child that may be considered higher functioning, or if you're going to the adult world of developmental disabilities in New York State, okay? So in any event, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be supportive. There's multiple systems to receive services, with their own eligibility criteria. There's no longer one system. The school district, and that's why I meant in terms of supporting, there is no supportive school district that's just coordinating everything for you. New eligibility criteria for services. Eligibility is not transferred from high school. Unlike school, where special education is an entitlement, the federal law requires that children with special needs get a free and appropriate public education. When you graduate, it is voluntary. You need to find the programs and services that fit, apply for them, and meet the criteria. There is no committee oversight, no CSE. It is self-directed by either the parent, if they have guardianship and the child can't direct it themselves, or in college, in a college setting, the child in college themselves, okay? The coordination and follow-through must be done by the person themselves or the guardian. In some cases, there may be a case manager or a Medicaid service coordinator, but not in all. And something I just want to hit home is we sometimes, when we're talking about transition, really forget about those students who go to college, and I just want to make sure we are clear that there is no IEP or CSE in college, and that's why the transition program for students going to college that had an IEP in high school is just as important as the transition for a child moving from school to the developmental disability system in New York State. And that is one of the reasons why we are actually separating out once we go through this initial transition webinar. If you have a child going to college, what specifically do you need to look for? What is college like in one of our webinars? And then we will also have a subsequent webinar where we speak specifically about the developmental disability world, because they're different, but the transition requirements of the IDEA are the same. So we need to discuss what that means. So did I just scare you? This is scary. It's scary stuff. It's scary for the parent and the students. If anybody knows me outside of me doing this webinar or heard me speak, I have a child with significant special needs, and there will be one day where he will be, and it's getting closer because he's almost 15, he will be an adult and involved in adult services, and it's complicated stuff. So it's scary. And it's also scary for the student, because typically, even in a typical situation where a child is going to college and did not have an IEP in high school, it's a difficult transition. But when you had special services in high school and you're going to college, which is different, it's very scary. And it's also scary for children like my son, who are really accessing multiple systems and maybe dealing with different groups of people rather than their teachers that they see every day post-school. But what does the law say? The law says, the IDEA, which I spoke to you a little bit about, and if you want to know all about the IDEA, not just the transition part, again, all of our past webinars are on demand. The IDEA is the federal special education law. So The purpose of the IDA is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services, designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. That highlighted section is the crux of what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, and also look at that last part of the paragraph. It says further education. That was added to the IDEA in 2004 because there was data that showed that students leaving high school leaving high school who had an IEP in high school were not doing well in college because they weren't well prepared. So we put further education right in the purpose of the IDEA because there absolutely is an expectation that a child with an IEP can continue on to college, community college, or some other educational program. We're not just sending children with special needs to employment and independent living skills. And typically a lot of the transition services that are done by the district or that we're used to seeing have to do with life skills or employment skills, that being the next step. But that's not always the next step. Further education may be the next step, and if that is your child's goal, we need to look at it. So what else does the law say? So if your child has an IEP, and at an age, which we'll talk about, I believe, the next slide, the transition services mean a coordinated set of activities designed within a result-oriented process, focusing on improving academic and functional achievement that facilitates the child's movement to post-school activities. That's in addition to what you typically have on the IEP, and we'll go into more detail about that. These coordinated set of activities, the law says, are based on the child's needs, taking into account the child's strengths, very important, okay, preferences and interests, because most children, just like I did when I was in high school, have certain dreams of things that they want to be, but that may not align with their strength. Okay, I wanted to be a physician, and it turned out that wasn't science, and blood was really not a strength of mine. So sometimes we don't, so a student may say, oh yeah, I want to be a doctor. Is that realistic? Is that a strength? That they're doing well in science? So we don't just listen to strength, preferences. We also need to look at the child's strengths. So it's instruction and preferences, interests that includes instruction, related services, community experiences, development of employment and other post-living objectives, acquisition of daily living skills, and a provision of a functional vocation evaluation if appropriate. This is huge. This is in addition to what the school district needs to do on your child's IEP. This isn't just kind of built into it, okay? So what else, okay? The law says the child must be invited to the meeting if there will be a discussion of post-secondary goals and or transition services. It's very important, regardless of your child's functioning level, but it's simply more important than ever if you have a child that can communicate their preferences, it may be going to college because they are going to have to learn to do this themselves in college, and they need to be clued in, if you haven't clued them in already, that they learn differently than other children, and they have to be able to, or young adults, and they have to be able to articulate that in college or when they are advocating for themselves post-school. Also, the law says the child must be, now, the child must be invited to the meeting. I'm encouraging you to bring the child at least for a portion of the meeting if it's their first time, but it's not a requirement that they be at the meeting, so I just want to be clear with that. Also, the child must be provided with an exit plan, which should include recommendations on how to assist the child in meeting the child's post-secondary goals. So you'll get this kind of piece of paper that's like your walking papers, and you know, this is how you graduated in special ed, and we may need that paper to go to the college or to go to the adult services so they can, you know, really refer to it and look to it when looking at programming for your child. So this shouldn't be just a cookie cutter exit plan. So this is great. So you know how I had a slide a couple of slides ago that talked about how scary this is? This is actually so great, because there are transition requirements in the IDEA, and they provide an opportunity when you're young enough to do it, and when you're still in the supportive school system environment, to think about the future plan and life after high school, to plan a course of study, to make the high school experience during the transition time relate directly to the true student's dreams and goals for the future. Assist in making linkages after high school. There's an old saying that, you know, when you're going into the adult world of developmental disabilities in New York State, that all of a sudden the school bus stops coming, okay? It doesn't automatically transfer when you're 21. You have to have made these connections and linkages prior to exiting, because the school bus, if you don't, will actually stop coming, okay? And this is so great because it increases the chance for every student to be successful, as they can be after exiting high school. And why is this great? I have to tell you that if other students, if general education students that were going on to college or going on to employment post-school had this opportunity and requirement, the parents would be jumping for joy, because the transition to the adult world, regardless of what you do, is difficult, especially difficult for our children, and we need to be aware of the transition process and insist that it be discussed and that you have a meaningful transition plan that can really help your child. Parents sometimes don't know this, and I, unfortunately, get the cases where the child couldn't make it, you know, in college because they never got the requisite skills. And when that happens, 9 times out of 10, it has nothing to do with their academic ability. If it did, they probably wouldn't have gotten into that college. But what it has to do with is the child not seeking out, or the transition plan that the school district provided had nothing to do with assisting the child with their issues post-school. So we want to make sure, given this opportunity that we have, which is so great, and it's a federal law, that means that it can't, New York can't mess with the federal requirements, that we take advantage of that. So we also have New York State's regulations, Article 89 and Part 200. These are New York special education laws. Again, they can't take away anything that the IDEA gives us. They fully take them into account, but they also offer more specific state rules and regulations. So what are some of the significant differences in terms of transition? Again, we're only talking about transition in New York versus the IDEA. New York has incorporated most of the same things as the IDEA, except in 2 areas. Okay, so the big differences between what New York has given us, which is more than the federal requirements, is that in New York, the transition IEP must be in effect at 15. So if you have a meeting, so for instance, my son is turning 15 in a month. We had to discuss transition at his last CSE meeting because the transition part of the IEP has to be in effect when the child is 15. So we had that discussion for the first time, which is extremely frightening, even for me who knew it was going to happen, to discuss post-school outcomes and post-school goals when he was 14 the year prior. Okay, and that is a New York rule because the IDEA says 16. All right. New York requires also a vocational assessment at 12, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. You're probably saying, hey, my kid's 16, 17, they never had a vocational assessment. Sometimes that, now, of course, I'm going to give you a website at the end of the webinar. New York State gives us, model forms for level 1 assessments, we call them, instead of vocational assessment. Gives us model forms. But typically at 12, it's really taking a look at the child and saying, maybe this is a child that's not going to be on Regents track or will be on Regents track. And it could be as easy, there's no specific requirements about what that level 1 assessment needs to look at. And sometimes parents don't even realize that their child is not on Regents track, or what not being on Regents track means, which is a whole other webinar we're going to talk about too. Okay, so I just want to state that every year there's a significant push from school districts and school boards sometimes and PTAs sometimes to get rid of, to have something called mandate relief, which are things that the school district, doesn't really have to provide and is not reimbursed for. So, this year in particular in the budget, they are looking at, bringing New York more, or giving districts themselves the opportunity to align themselves with the federal law and not give that extra stuff that New York provides in terms of special education. So, you should pay attention to this because that's a whole year, possibly, if your child turns 15 in September, that your child would be missing out on transition services if this passes and your school district opts into it. So, I always make myself available to legislators when they are talking about budget issues to explain why this is not good, write letters and things like that. So, if that's something that you care about, you should take a look at the budget and what's going on in Albany, as we may not have this at the same way. If I do the same webinar next year, this may not be the rule. So this is the website actually that when I'm referring to the website, I give this in all of my talks and webinars because this is really the best resource for parents because we are in New York State, so finding resources outside of New York State are typically not helpful in a CSE meeting in New York State. We want to be looking at New York State regulations and things like that. So again, how long are you covered under the IDEA? Through the end of the year, which a child turns 21 or graduates, whichever is sooner. So we have all these requirements. So let's talk about what a good transition IEP should contain. All right? So now this is nowhere in the law. This should be done pro forma, but unfortunately, I never blame school districts. I always start in a collaborative way with them. I do have a job, so of course it does break down. I certainly don't think districts are intentionally missing the boat on this. I just think that, especially in terms of the transition requirements for students going into college, they don't really spend a lot of time with this. And the transition plans that I see, again, when a child is not successful in their post-school endeavor, is I look at the IEP and I say, oh darn, you know, if we could have just gone back in time and changed this. So these are things that should be in a good transition plan. A very good present levels of performance. And again, we talked about, and that's why it's very important that we, you know, one of the reasons I insisted on doing these webinars in a series is they all build upon one another. So in the first webinar, which I ask you to go back and look at on demand, it's on our website, www.specialneedsnewyork is what are the present levels of performance. The big difference in the present levels of performance from the year prior to the year in which the child turns 15 is the last thing, as the last item on that list. For the transition age student, we need to have a discussion at this point of how that disability will affect the student's participation in post-school activities. So there's another aspect that we need to explore, because as we discussed in those earlier webinars, the goals of the IEP, which in my opinion are the most important part of your IEP, which is your contract with the district, are based specifically on present levels of performance. So if there's a need in the present levels of performance, there should be a coordinating goal. Okay, so we should look for that in our IEPs or in when we get them back to make sure that's in there, and we should talk about the child's ability or how their disability will affect the student's participation in post-school activities. Very important. So what else must a good transition IEP contain? Measurable post-secondary goals. These aren't yearly goals. This is in addition to yearly goals. What are the projected post-school outcomes? Okay, these are based upon age-appropriate transition assessments. Is the child going to college? You know, is the child not going to college? What can the child do? What can the child not do? What are their strengths? The things we talked about in terms of what you need to look at when coming up with the transition plan. It's based on person-centered planning. It's not a cookie-cutter plan. Remember, we're still an individualized, and I'm stressing the individualized education program run by the school district. We're not talking about a cookie-cutter IEP. We're talking about a transition plan that is person-centered. The person is what is driving the planning of post-secondary goals. They need to be result-oriented, enrolled in, will work full-time, and typically they will determine the course of study. And let me just give you some examples of what post-secondary goals can look like. You know, they're typically in 4 areas. They don't have to be in all 4 areas if the child doesn't have needs in all 4 areas. But let's say, you know, post-school training, you know, that Don will go to welding school. That is the goal. Okay, so at 15, Don has expressed a desire that he wants to be a welder, okay? And now that may change because we have yearly IEP meetings, but maybe at 15 we are going to explore whether that can be done with his skill set, okay? And so these are projected post-secondary goals. These aren't for sure, okay? So education, you know, Carlos, different than Don, will attend a 4-year college to study computers. He's interested in computers. So, you know, the child will attend college. Typically, a transition plan for college that I see is, you know, Carlos will attend a 4-year university, and that's the entire projected goal and the entire transition plan. Employment. Adriana, different than Carlos and Don, will work in a job where she can help others with disabilities. You know, independent living skills when appropriate. You know, Marcy wants to live in her own apartment. If Marcy, like my son Aaron, you know, has to live in a very supervised environment, and his goal is to live in his own apartment, if it's really, and if it's possible for him to do so, this needs to be explored, okay? And we need to learn the skills necessary to live in an independent apartment to see if it's going to work, okay? And then next year we could change it. So these post-secondary goals, and I can't hit home enough about this, are so important. What is person-centered planning? It's listening to the student and his circle of support, identifying abilities, interests, and a vision for the future. Identify what community supports are out there, and really write a plan for life. And again, this can change, and that's why we have this beautiful, if we take advantage of the 15 time to really start this process. If your child's graduating at 21, that's a long time to think about this and really examine what will work and what won't work and kind of test it out at the school district level, so we're not setting out our child for failure when they graduate. And as parents, this is the difficult part, because this isn't parent-centered planning. So even if, which we'll discuss at a later webinar, and I may touch on it a little bit if we have time today, even if you are your child's guardian, which means that you can make every single decision for your child, everything in the adult world that's coming down from Albany right now is person-centered. So they're going to say, Cheryl, I know that you want, Aaron to live in an apartment with supports, but we don't think that that is possible, and we don't think that's what Aaron wants. And we have examined, because we did person-centered planning, and we don't think Aaron has the ability to do that, and he really hasn't expressed it. So sometimes, and this is with any child, okay, I'm not saying that, they're not going to listen to you and that you're not going to be a collaborative part of this team, but they are really going to start to listen to or get a sense, if the child can't communicate, of what is realistic, what the child wants to do, and not only what the parent wants to do. And whether we have a child with special needs, this is a transition process in general, because a child going to college and choosing a major, it may not be in line with what a parent wanted their child to be. Maybe my father, who's a physician, wanted me to be a physician, but I realized in college that it wasn't for me. So the same type of analysis has to go into it when we do person-centered planning, whatever a child's functioning is. So that's very, very important. So also, these are all things that are outside of your regular IEP. Okay, you still have the regular parts of the IEP that you have every year. When you have a transition plan, you're going to set really your child's course of study, what road they're going to be taking, an academic road versus a non-academic road. It needs to be relevant to the student goals. You need to access the general education curriculum whenever possible. You need to access to state and district-wide assessments and a plan for graduation. So courses of study are not simply a recording of classes already taken, but it should be a long-range educational plan that is a projection of future coursework. So this is when it really is important that we look at this early. Okay, because a lot of parents don't necessarily, and there's a lot more going on in the special ed world about regions versus non-regions diplomas, but if you are thinking that your child is going to get a high school diploma and they don't, that limits a lot of what your child can do. So let's say, for example, your child wants to choose a profession like to be a painter and be like a house painter and to be part of, and in order to do well in that profession, you need to be part of that house painters union. So let's say that child graduates without a high school diploma. That painters union may not allow you in without one. And so your child has graduated without being able to do what they want to do more than anything in the world, and that was not well planned. We didn't do person-centered planning, and we didn't think about it. And in that situation that I'm talking about, which isn't actually a real situation, that I came in contact with, I had in my office, thank God that the parent came to us before they exited or graduated out of special ed. They said, we just found out, and this is in the, the 10th hour, the child's, graduating out of school. They're getting what was then known as an IEP diploma. We just found out that, so-and-so cannot graduate, cannot do what he wanted to do because you, school district, and we, parents, did not know that a high school diploma was necessary, and we planned his entire course of study based on something he wanted to do, but we never examined what it meant to do that. So we were able to go back to the school district and, get some sort of transition planning, and that's not always, and that situation is unique. We can't always do that, and it's not ideal. And trust me, we get so many calls. Everyone's getting ready for summer vacation. When special ed attorneys like me and the other attorneys in this office start getting called in June, oh my God, my child's graduating, or in May, oh my God, my child's graduating. I don't know what's going on here. And it's good that you catch it before graduation, but not ideal at all, because we really need several years to develop a course of study for a plan for life. So this slide is going to be our entire next webinar. So I'm going to run through this very quickly so we don't run out of time, because when planning a course of study, we need to understand what the different diploma options are in New York State and what those options allow a child to do post-school. Now, this changed drastically last year. And school districts and us, at lawyers and advocates that work with students are still really getting used to it. I think it's a fabulous change for, even though it's complicated, for the one reason is that we no longer call a diploma, the certificate that the child receives when they leave special ed without a high school diploma, a diploma. So if your child graduated 2 years ago from special ed, they got something called an IEP diploma. And some parents misconstrued that as something that you could take to a college one day and enroll if your child has the ability to do so. That's not true, okay? That IEP diploma was not a high school diploma. So in terms of exit options, there's 3. I'm just going to briefly go over them because, again, I have an entire webinar. Our next webinar is talking about this slide, but I just want to tease it a little bit because it is really important if you don't get a chance to listen to the next webinar to understand that there are different options and different ways to exit. And I just want to make sure that when you look quickly at your child's IEP that you know what track they're on. There's a high school diploma track and a credential diploma track, okay? And there's also high school equivalency, which we'll just talk about very, very briefly. So, for general education students in New York State, you get a Regents diploma, okay? That Regents diploma allows a child to officially get a high school diploma that allows them to attend college, to be part of that labor union that I was talking about earlier. For special education students, there are other options, which that's what we're going to talk about in specifically. So your child can still get a high school diploma, and it can be a Regents diploma and also a local diploma, which is the same, well, it's not the same as a Regents diploma, but it will allow a child to go to college or enter a profession that requires a high school diploma, okay? And we are very blessed for children that are really on the cusp of you know, a Regents diploma and not getting a Regents diploma, to have a safety net built in so that a child can, with special needs and with an IEP, and even some children with 504s that we'll talk about the next webinar, can take advantage of this safety net and still graduate. But you've got to make sure that if you think your kid is getting a high school diploma, that they're on that side of the slide, okay? Because the other thing that you can get from the high school is a credential. And again, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there's 2 credentials that are out there. There's one called the Skills and Achievement Commencement Credential, and I hate the acronym for this. It's called the SACC, S-A-C-C, which is not a very good acronym. And this is only for students on the New York State Alternate Assessment. And if you're asking what the New York State Alternate Assessment is, and your child is over the age of 15, you really need to look at your IEP and really tune into the next couple of webinars, because if you think your child is going on to high school, on Regents or local diploma track, that was just your expectation, and they're on the alternate assessment, they're probably not on that track and will not graduate with a diploma. They will graduate with a credential. Now, the most confusing credential, which is completely new, is this thing called the CDAS, which I like the acronym more because the credential itself has an enormously long name. It's the New York State Career Development and Occupational Studies Commencement Credential. This can be in addition to the Regents or local diploma, or a standalone credential. In order to access this credential, you have to be on Regents or local diploma track, and that's in quotes. And this is not, again, for students that are getting on the New York State Alternate Assessment, or students that are on a course of study to get a SAC, a Skills and Achievement Commencement Credential. Okay? Confusing, but right now all you really need to know is the high school can give you 2 options, okay, to graduate, and you need to just make sure that you know and you're aware of what you're going to get at the end during this webinar. If you want to learn more specifics, tune in next time. There's just a little box down there called the high school equivalency test. We all know that about the GED. It's now called, believe it or not, the TASC, T-A-S-C test. Now, you'll say, well, you know, Cheryl, if they graduate with a, you know, with a credential, can't they always go back and get a GED? Really? I mean, do you think they give special ed GEDs or tasks? No. You may get accommodations for your testing, but you still have to pass, you know, high school equivalency in terms of getting that GED, and it's not part of the IDEA because you've graduated. So you're not going to get the same level of services, if services at all. So I mean, I don't even really want to talk about task for a child that's on the credential side, because if they can't access the high school diploma with support in high school, it's going to be even more difficult for them to try later on to do the task. So again, complicated, heavy-duty slide. We'll talk about it in much more detail. The entire slide will be broken down in the next 1-hour webinar. So what else must a transition IEP, a good transition IEP contain? Measurable annual goals. So now we're back to the regular annual goals, not the goals for life, the annual goals, the steps, the little mini steps that we take in our regular IEPs. Goals are yearly, okay? We're not expecting a child from, you know, 17 to 18 to develop every single skill that they need if they didn't have the skills before to go on to college, right? That's why we're knowing that this is coming at 15 is so important. Okay, so these are in addition to your annual goals that you have for the other needs that your child has. If the if the present levels of performance speak to issues that your child will have in a post-secondary environment, there should be a coordinating goal. And these are just included along with other goals. And we also did a previous webinar all about goal development. And like I said, goals are extremely important. So I just want to give you some examples of goals. And again, remember I told you after the diploma webinar, we're going to be doing a webinar that's really going to break down the types of goals and things to look out for if you have a child going on the college track or the child going on the non-college track. So these are examples of goals that will be broken down in those further webinars. This is only meant to be a general overview of transition and get you excited to think about transition because it's so important. So some examples of goals for a child looking on to college or post-secondary training is time management. You have a child with ADHD, and now they have to get up in the morning on their own, and they don't have mommy and daddy, you know, making sure they do their homework. We need to develop that now because it's coming. And the college is coming, and you don't have an IEP, and you know, and you're not going to have, you know, your child's going to be over 18, they're emancipated, you know, they may not want to listen to mommy and daddy. So in every single IEP for a child that is going on to college or post-secondary training, they need to understand and demonstrate the advocacy skills to obtain services. So there should always be an advocacy goal, okay, a self-advocacy goal for a child going on for college. I mean, for everyone there should, but particularly for a child going on to college, this is just left out because your child not only has to be able to advocate for themselves, but in order to do that, you have to have an understanding. For me to know that I have ADHD and need to go to college and ask for services, I need an understanding of what I can and cannot do and how to ask for it. And the child has to be, that's when I said earlier, you have to let the child in if you didn't really share with them, because sometimes children in the mainstream that may have an IEP are absolutely matriculating with other students. And they do at this point, if you've kind of kept it undercover, need to know that they learn differently. And actually we all learn differently, but they in particular have this opportunity under the law that we should be teaching the child how to be successful in post-school. And to be successful in post-school, and especially in a college setting, you need to understand your disability and be able to advocate for yourself. Some more examples of goals are organization and study skills, you know, if the present levels of performance suggest an issue in these areas, and if we need to work on improved basic academic skills. Again, you know, this is not an inclusive list, and we're going to talk about it in more detail in a later webinar. For employment, we need to talk about interview skills, resume building, getting along with other employees. If your child has social issues, and we're looking at a job where they're not going to be sitting alone in an office all day, and they have to interact with peers or superiors, and they're not able to do that, it's time to teach them because they're going to need it. You know, can they fill out the job application necessary? That's why this is just such a tremendous opportunity, because the law says, school district, you know, let's develop goals and let's work on these things, okay? Independent living, if your child's looking to, you know, on more of a life skills route, you still want to teach them the skills for independent living that they can do. Okay, so to organize and maintain possessions, to wash and dry and iron their own clothes, or to participate, to count money, give direct change. And if you cannot do that, there are other ways to do it. We always, of course, want to teach a child how to use money, and that's the most acceptable way to go into a store and exchange and buy things. But for children that can't grasp the concept of value, this is the time to think about other ways, because you want your child to understand that they have to go into a store and they can't just take, they have to buy. This is a big deal, okay? They're not always going to have a teacher in there. They may be tempted to take something. So maybe we can teach a child a non-money way to do that, for example. And again, I'm not recommending this. It would be based on your child's needs. Maybe we're looking at, for the first year of transition, let's try to see if we can understand the money. And then if it really looks like we've been doing money for so many years and now even in the transition we can't get money straight, let's look at other options. Teaching a child to use a debit card. Teaching a child to use a debit card along with an iPad or an online banking account where they can watch the value going down as they use the debit card, because that's a skill that can be worked on individually in the school district setting. So we want to test the waters, and if we know that this is not a strength money, are there alternatives? If we can't do it, we can't do it. But you never want to say we didn't try. For example, I mean, Aaron, we're still pushing. My son, that's my son's name if I didn't mention it, he's turning 15. We're certainly pushing for him to understand money, but I'm getting to the point where, I'm going to talk to the district and talk to the school about putting together an alternative type of a goal, because he needs that skill and he hasn't been able to grasp the concept for years. Now, he has been able to grasp the value, but money is still difficult for him. So even though he can go in the store and make change, I always talk about that, because math was never a good, a good subject for him. But, I really think it's important for him to understand the use of a debit card, because he can't really, he's not someone that can keep his wallet on him, and someone will take the money from him. So I want him to have a more electronic way to take advantage of the goals. So also we have a coordinated set of activities that we talked about. These need to be based on the individual needs of the student. So these are in addition to possibly the other skills related services that your child needs. So in addition to their regular speech and OT or counseling services, there may be some other services, because they're now transition age, that they may need. So I'm just going to give you a quick example of John, because we are running out of time. John is going to graduate at 18. He is going to get a high school diploma. He's not looking to go to college. It's not in his skill set. He really wants to go and get a job, and this is something that we think he's capable of right now, and something he wants to do based on all the assessments. So John's goal, is to graduate high school and get a job in landscaping, gardening, or flower design. That's his goal. So what should his coordinated set of activities look like? So on this chart, now again, this is my dream set of coordinated set activities, but I actually got this set of coordinated activities from an example on the New York State site. So even though this happens to be my dream set of coordinated set of activities, it's what New York State gave as the example. So I'm just putting that out there. So what will it take for John to achieve his dreams? Instruction, resource room, which the home district, will take care of, a horticulture class, and maybe the district, because that's right and it was determined right for John, ABC Career and Technical Center will take care of that, and we have a date when that's going to take effect related services, counseling services, by the home district, and maybe a job coach. Okay, now, and if that's not something the school district can provide, they can contract with another agency. Resume development, interview skills, and job application completion, home district would probably provide that. Community experiences, 3 community experiences with job coaching, the different types of horticulture classes or careers. We want to even explore within that. Florist, retail, landscaping, that the school district can't handle themselves, so the the agency will do that. For John, there is no need for the acquisition of activities of daily living and a functional vocational assessment. So this is not a cookie-cutter IEP. Okay, we talk about agency participation. Again, we're going to talk much more about agency participation at our webinar where we talk about children not going on to college. So the district may contract with a state or local agency to provide some of the transition services. So it's time to get familiar. And sometimes people ask me, how come when you had a child that was 2 years old with autism, or I think he was 3, did you get on the board of ARC Westchester? It's because I knew that Aaron, my son, was going to spend much more time in the adult world than he was in school setting, and I wanted to see what ARC would be like. Now, there are a lot of great agencies out there, and I just don't serve on their board. I just served on the ARC board. But for me, it was very important to have an introduction, regardless of what it was, to what the adult world looked like. So if your child is 12, 13, 14, and it looks like you are going to be on the non-diploma track and using an agency for services post-school, you should start looking and familiarizing yourselves with that. So the school, when you're done at 21, you're not just being forced into a program that has an opening because the school bus stopped coming. You're actually being part of an agency that you want to. So again, the keys to a successful transition are self-determination and self-advocacy. I cannot stress this enough. And since we're running out of time, I absolutely ask you, and so I don't really have time for questions, I ask you to please, if you want more information on this, to take advantage of listening to our next webinars, and to also think about the webinar also, which is our final webinar in the series about planning for the future, because we'll be talking about guardianship. And I thank you so much for participating today, and I hope that, and on behalf of Littman Krooks, I thank you as well, and I hope that you will tune in for the remaining webinars in our special webinar series. And again, you can go back and access our old webinars on www.specialneedsnewyork.com, www.specialneedsnewyork.com, and my contact information and the firm contact information is on our website. So thank you very much, and I hope to present to you again. Have a wonderful afternoon.